What's going on, everyone? I am Jeff St. Pierre, and this is episode 177 of the Adult Education Podcast. Thank you so much for sharing some of your day with me. Let's take a trip back in time to a magical time called the 80s so we can have a discussion about the classic film Labyrinth with Jes Battis. Those of us over a certain age will remember making a trip to the video store with their parents. The anticipation and stress was high because you only got one shot to pick out the perfect movie for the weekend. If you got the wrong one, then you were stuck until your parents could bring you back to exchange it. Do you remember the movie you rented the most? Oddly enough, my parents let me get Howard the Duck over and over again. I think about that now and I laugh because there's no reason I should have been watching that as like a 10-year-old. The 80s were definitely just a different time all around. For a lot of people my generation, Labyrinth was that movie. It was often sold out at the video store, hard to find. Created by Jim Henson, this fantasy film starring David Bowie was a hit with kids. The 80s were a big decade for fantasy films as a whole. Labyrinth, along with The Never-Ending Story, The Dark Crystal, Legend, Willow, and so many others, dominated home rentals. These films became instant cult classics and taught so many of us to dream big and use our imaginations. They may have also scarred us for life. I will never get over Artex dying in The Never-Ending Story. Never. If you've been listening to the Adult Education Podcast, then you know that I've had conversations with authors that took part in ECW Press's Pop Classics series. We discussed the lasting legacy of the films Clueless and The Crow. This time, we're taking on Labyrinth. As a cis male of Caucasian descent, I viewed this movie through a particular set of glasses. The author of It's Only Forever, Labyrinth, book 17 in the series, Jes Battis, watched it through very different lenses. Jes takes us on a journey of nostalgia as they point out the complexity of Jim Henson's wild world. It's easy to watch this movie and just take it at face value for its entertainment. It's conversations like this, though, that open my eyes to a lot of the deeper meanings that my weird brain doesn't pick up. They are the reason I love discussing pop culture with people because things have different meanings to everyone. This conversation will go down as one of my favorites out of all the episodes that I've done of this podcast. So I really hope that you enjoy my conversation with Jes Battis. Well, Jes, it is a pleasure to meet you. I have really enjoyed this sort of trip down memory lane reading this book about Labyrinth. It brought back a lot of memories, as I'm sure it did for you as you were putting it all together. I'd love to hear from you why you wanted to take on this project.
Oh, sure. I mean, Labyrinth was one of the first films that I remember watching as a kid. I talk a little bit in the book about how when my parents got divorced, my dad took me to a lot of matinees because he was out of work. So I ended up probably seeing movies that I was a little bit too young to see. And Labyrinth was just one of those films that really stuck with me. And I always knew that I had kind of a longer essay in me about Labyrinth, but it wasn't until I kind of became more familiar with the Pop Classic series that I thought, oh, this is kind of neat because it sort of looks at the film as a kind of cultural artifact. And so I just started with the kind of proposition that, you know, Labyrinth is a movie that is all about kind of liberating you as a viewer and as a person, and I went from there. But I still feel like I could keep writing about the film. It's every time I watch it, I find something new.
So I'm going to go back to the Pop Classic series for just a second because I don't know if everybody else knows about this yet. I've been lucky enough to interview two of your peers. I did one conversation about the Clueless book, one about the book on The Crow, two of my favorite movies from the 90s. So it's a pleasure to talk about one of my favorite movies from the 80s with you. But I wonder, how do you get involved with the Pop Classic series? Do they reach out to you? Do you reach out to them and say, hey, I've got this wacky idea? Like, how does the Pop Classic series come together?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. I've listened in prep for this interview. I listened to the Clueless interview with Veronica Litt, and then also the Fast and the Furious interview with Barry Hertz. So those are my two lenses for thinking about the podcast. Yeah, in my case, I had heard about it because I had read a couple of the books in the series just by other academics that I knew. In particular, Hannah McGregor's book Clever Girl about Jurassic. It's like a feminist reading of Jurassic Park. And so I knew I wanted to approach them, and essentially what you can do with that series, because it's under the umbrella of the Toronto publisher ECW. The managing editor of Pop Classics, Jen Suk-Fon Lee, she's a Vancouver author. She'll just take email queries. So you can just query and say, I have this idea. Although, as she said to me, like, they get a lot of queries that don't really fit the series because it's people will say, I'm really into My Little Pony, and I want to talk a lot about it. And what they're kind of looking for is a project that's manageable and that thinks about a film that has a lot of kind of like resonance across time, I think,
Mm.
that and cross audience appeal, and something that will allow you to kind of dig into deeper stuff like Veronica Litt's conversation about Clueless and what it means to value pop culture. I think what I was thinking about with It's Only Forever was Jim Henson's kind of career as an artist and how he always was kind of leaning towards human rights and
Mhm.
liberation and being yourself, and but also knowing that yourself is always changing. So they like to have there be a kind of a like almost a theoretical foundation to the proposal, but there are a lot of great titles in that series. I haven't read the one on the Crow yet, but I'm really interested. And there's one on Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles that I keep meaning to start.
Yeah, I got to get into that one too. I saw that one on the list, and it's definitely on my list to dive into. The Crow one was interesting. So this is my first dive into the pop classics was the Clueless book. So I was kind of thinking that they all would have a similar formation, discussing a moment in pop culture history and how that impacted us. How does it still impact us today? And then I read The Crow, and it was much more about tying the movie into the author's personal journey through darkness and
Yeah.
depression. So it was a very different vibe, and I loved it. I loved that it was different. And then I get to your book about Labyrinth, and there's a lot about the queer story in there. And for me,
Hmm.
as a 45-year-old white straight male, I
Yeah.
hadn't watched Labyrinth through that lens before, and I hadn't thought of that. Like, I know David Bowie's history, I know David Bowie's, passion in the queer community, but I hadn't thought of the movie through that lens. So it was really interesting to see your thoughts about that and how so much of the movie could be interpreted differently than say I did.
Yeah, I one of the things that one of the reasons I think I wanted to write this book, in particular, thinking about kind of gender and sexuality, was that there were so many people I would talk to, like queer and trans friends and coworkers and colleagues, who, when you ask them like, "What was your kind of sexual awakening?" they'd say, "Oh, David Bowie and Labyrinth," and I was like, "Huh." That's interesting because he's such a weird character in that film. And I was interested in how he goes through so many different transformations. Like he's never just one person or one thing. Sometimes he's an owl, sometimes he's a goblin, sometimes he's like a living swan. And so it seems like there was something about that essence of transformation and transition maybe that people really connected with. Like you don't just have to have one body, you don't just have to be one thing. And I think one of the reasons I connected with Bowie too is he just like doesn't really seem like he wants to be there in the movie. Like he has this like Bowie the performer, he's giving this really fascinating performance where he's giving it his all, but he's also playing this kind of slightly bored, slightly
Mhm.
petulant character who's like, yeah, I'm at the heart of a fairy tale, but I kind of want something more too. Sarah, played by Jennifer Connelly, she's the same. Like she doesn't just want to be in her suburban household. She wants something more. So the film to me always it feels like a lot about desire and longing. But Henson's work, another reason I always found it fascinating is that it's not really romantic. Like Henson often never really dramatized
Sure.
like traditional relationships. And so his most kind of long-running relationship is Kermit and Miss Piggy, which is not really like a traditional relationship. So that maybe can be kind of freeing as well for people.
About Henson, you have a quote in the book. I think I typed it down correctly, but you say essentially Jim Henson has always mined that essential layer of oddness within his films and shows. They draw our eye to what's different and challenge us at times. That feels like the brilliance of Jim Henson. And I never really thought of it from that perspective, but it's so true. Everything he's done with his characters and the stories that he's made over the years, there is a layer of weird and strange, but yet we still accept it and we love it and we find the things to enjoy. I mean, Snuffleupagus alone, I mean, for crying out loud, what is this animal? But like you've got all these creatures he's made and they're beloved 40, 50 years after they came out, still to this day. It's kind of interesting how that worked for him.
Yeah, he was like he's such a fascinating person to study because he had this really intense work ethic where he never took time off. Even when he got quite sick, he just still it didn't occur to him to take time off, and he kind of tried to instill that, I think, in his kids as well. But he also had this. There was kind of a paradox in his work where people would describe him as a puppeteer, and they saw that as like children's theater. And he was always in interviews saying, "Well, no, this it's like a much older art form. I don't think of myself as a children's performer." And if you watch some of his older work, it's very um like risque almost. There's lots of kind of humor around mortality. He was commissioned to do these commercials for a coffee company called Watkins in the 60s, and he had like two puppets shooting each other, and the commercial was like, "What are you doing? Like this is supposed to be about coffee." He's like, "Well, this is what I produced." And so there's this layer of kind of the slightly odd, the slightly perverse in his work, but also it's so kind of life affirming at the same time. But you could tell he's someone who's like working in all these different registers. Watching Labyrinth, as someone who's in their 40s now, I see a lot of that adult humor with the character of Hoggle, who's like, fairies are annoying, and being kind of like he's not really fulfilling his potential. He's a bit of a coward. David Bowie playing this annoyed, irritable Goblin King who's like, "Yeah, I'll destroy this little girl's life. Why not?" There's this a real kind of mine of interesting humor I find in Henson's work that really appeals to me.
I don't know if you thought about this much, but since we're talking about it, I'm going to go down this road for just a second because you're talking about Jim Henson. And if you talk about, or you go back and you look at like even the old school Muppet Show, there's a lot of adult humor in that. But our parents would be like, "Oh, Muppets, let's just put it on. This must be for the kids." I mean, we just watched with my daughter, and I'm not, worried about it with her. I have a 5-year-old daughter. We just watched the most recent Muppet Show that had Sabrina Carpenter as a guest. Love Sabrina. We're big fans. But I'm watching it. I'm like, wow, this is not the children's Muppets.
Yeah.
But if you go back and watch them, those weren't the children's Muppets either. I feel like we had a very different view of what children's stuff was back in the 80s, right? Like you said, you saw this movie Labyrinth when you were 8 years old. I don't know when I saw it, but I know it came out when I was 5. I couldn't imagine I saw it that much later than that. I remember renting it at the movie store way back when. There's no reason I should have been watching that movie at, say, 6 years old. Like I tried to watch it with my 5-year-old daughter. She was like, "I can't. This is too much. Turn it off."
Terrifying. Yeah.
But like, I just think we had a different mindset of what was children and what wasn't back in the 80s.
The 80s was kind of a fascinating era just because, the absolutely like the rails were flying off the US in terms of just like absolute devotion to capitalism. The US government becoming kind of like a theocracy. All of this was happening. But there was also this like interesting renaissance of fantasy films where I think people wanted to escape, and they also wanted to go back to kind of older stories like fairy tales with magic, and it was also hitting just at the right moment where kind of proto CGI technology was emerging, computer graphics, and so suddenly what was possible to kind of portray in cinema was really exploding. And so it was like, let's tell all the stories. And some of the films that came out in the 80s are just these like cocaine fueled like incredible dream visions where you're like, nobody said no to these writers. Like nobody in the writers room ever said no. But sometimes you get a film like Labyrinth where you have these cuddly characters like Ludo, where Jennifer Connelly says, "Oh, you're such a nice beast. There's nothing threatening about you." And then you have these weird fiery characters who are pulling their limbs off and being like, "Join us in our crazy dance." And that to me is kind of 80s. The register, the tone of the 80s is like everything is permissible. Capitalism is sort of driving us towards destruction. So let's just do everything absolutely possible. And I think we tend to think of it as a like cinematically that it's a conservative period, but we also see the rise of like teen cinema, like through
Yeah.
John Hughes. We see all kinds of movies that are kind of striving towards human rights. And then there's the AIDS crisis, which is looming over everything. And we're seeing these kind of sly representations. Like Henson didn't necessarily have openly queer characters, but he had openly queer puppeteers, people that he worked with. He told stories through kind of rich metaphor and thinking about mortality and valuing human life. So a lot was possible in that era, but also looking back, you think, yeah, we probably consumed a lot of media that we weren't quite ready for.
When we look back at the things that are pop culture to ourselves, we always hold certain things in higher regard than maybe some other people do. Like my dad would always talk about Animal House as the funniest thing he's ever seen in
Yeah,
his life.
yeah.
And it is a great film, but my generation, it was American Pie. And American Pie is 100 times crazier than Animal House could ever dream to
Yeah.
have been, right? So it's interesting how we hold these things. No, but I wonder from your perspective, because we're about the same age, from your perspective, could we have had those movies in any other era since? Like, I don't think we have that same fantasy world today that we had in the 80s. Like you referenced in the book Neverending Story and Legend and The Dark Crystal comes up. This group of films that came in the 80s, I can't think of another group along those lines that had the same impact, if you will.
Yeah, I think it was a kind of this interesting perfect storm of a rise in technological innovation in cinema, so that there were certain kind of impossible things that you could portray on screen, but also it was this real golden age of like practical effects in
Mm.
horror movies and in fantasy movies. And I think we're seeing that now. We're seeing some horror films in the current era that are kind of returning to that focus on like gore and practical effects and what we can do with just like some baking soda and some and pig's blood and things like that. But I think the 80s were kind of, it was this really interesting synthesis of those two things, of what can we portray, and then also in the context of Henson, like the way that he created worlds through just practical materials. He was so meticulous. I don't know, like when I talk to my students about Labyrinth, they will often say, I think, we didn't really encounter this film in the era in which it was meant to be viewed in. So they see it through the lens of like online culture and through the lens of CGI and how pervasive that is. So it's, I think, but with their parents are the ones that are kind of trying to get them to think more about it. Yeah, could we? No, there is a Labyrinth remake that's in the pipeline, directed by Robert Eggers, who's known for doing The Witch and other films like that. And he is a director who's like very focused on constructing historical worlds meticulously. So I'm really curious what that might look like. But at the same time, I don't know that we can recapture exactly what Labyrinth was trying to do. When we think about that scene in the movie where the camera pans over Jennifer Connelly's bedroom and it's just like this family is wealthy. They're wealthy middle class, full of toys, games. She's got everything that she could ever imagine, but she's still just like furious that she has to look after her baby brother. It's like a middle class 80s fairy tale, and I don't know how we would exactly convey that now. I'm so scared there's going to be a version of Labyrinth where all the characters are texting,
Right.
and I don't want that, right? Like the whole point of the film is like all these miscommunications and riddles. Like how do we get the characters to think critically if they're just like looking stuff up on ChatGPT? So that's my fear.
Yeah, I wonder now because there has been sort of a resurgence in a way like Stranger Things became a big hit and there's no
Yeah.
cell phones in that, obviously. My wife and I were just watching that show Friday Night Lights for the first time. And even though that takes
Yeah.
place, I think
Great.
in like 2007 to 2010 or something like that,
Yeah.
none of the characters like ever have cell phones, which blows my mind. And I'm like, how do none of, like we all had cell phones at
Mhm.
that time. We were texting. They're never communicating. But I do wonder, yeah, what would they do with that? Because it just feels like there are certain time periods that I don't know if you can remake it the same way. It would have to be a very different film if you were trying to make it current. If you tried to remake it and put it in the 80s, well, okay, sure. But if you're trying to say Labyrinth in 2026, I don't know how you do. I don't know how you do it.
There's a weird moment in the book. I talk about this really obscure like labyrinth game for Amiga computer that really it was not popular. Not a lot of people played it, but the way that the game starts is that you as the character kind of go to a theater and you end up watching Labyrinth the film. And it's very sort of meta, and it makes me think that well. Yeah, maybe a film like that could be rebooted, thinking about technology and surveillance. But and fairy tales, they are timeless. It's one of the reasons why we keep returning to them just because they were often trying to teach really primordial lessons, like don't go in the forest alone. If a weird man wants to talk to you, don't talk to him. Don't trust stepmothers because, why did your dad remarry in the first place? Your stepmother's probably evil. A lot of that stuff is timeless, so I think we can, in some interesting ways, return to it. But I also get anxious about kind of reboot culture, especially how we're trying to, like, I think in the same way that AI scrapes and extracts information, we're trying to kind of scrape the 80s
Mhm.
and return to that because we are, I think, in a political moment that is extraordinarily similar to the Reagan 80s. It's except like if do we call him a president? I don't know. Like if the so Trump as dictator, like if Reagan's dementia was much more intense and Reagan had had access to corporations that had much, much more money and much more control than they did. It feels like that's where we are right now. So maybe I don't know, there's a space for, I think, talking about that sense of rebooting, but it does make me wonder, like, why do we keep going back to the 80s over and over again? And that was one of the reasons I wanted to talk about that context.
Yeah, and I've thought about that idea too, because the 80s and 90s, there just seems to be such an affinity for those time periods right now. And I know everything is cyclical. I get it. When I was in high school in the 90s, the 70s were back. Everybody had bell bottoms on and stuff like that. So I get it. Pop culture is cyclical. But I also don't think pop culture exists today the same way that it did, because we no longer have that sort of monoculture anymore. We don't have those moments the same way, like the finale of Friends, where literally everybody in this country went to work the next day, got a glass of water at the water cooler, and started talking about it. Now everybody's kind of siphoned off into their own directions via social media. So I don't know, like, what are we going to go back to the early 2000s in mind, right? Like, we have to go to the things that everyone, like, even if you haven't seen Labyrinth, you've heard of Labyrinth. You're aware of what this movie is. And if you put 50 people that are between the ages of 40 and 50 into a room, I bet you 48 of them have seen Labyrinth. I don't know if you can say that about movies that come out today. I think pop culture is just so different too.
Well, it's an issue that we see a lot, I think, in post-secondary classrooms, and high school teachers see this as well, where trying to find films and books and television shows that our students can recognize, they are all in their own kind of individual stream, as you've said. So it is actually really hard you can't really cite something that everyone has had experience of. I found like feels like a weird swerve, but like the death of James Vanderbeek,
Sure.
I found like it affected me in a surprising way because I could remember in the late 90s watching Dawson's Creek, and at the end of, the episode would end and then immediately my phone would ring and it would be one of my friends being like, did you watch it? What do you think? And we would dissect it that way. Whereas now I think rather than people waiting for the episode to end, they're texting or like live tweeting
Mhm.
or live blue skying, whatever we call it on blue sky. They're doing it while the skeeting, I guess. they're they're doing it they're doing it while the episode is happening. So we're not consuming it in the way that I don't think it was meant to be consumed. But at the same time, I think about current discussions around Netflix and what they call like the second screen phenomenon,
Mhm.
where they're continually inserting more exposition into the plot because they understand that a lot of the audience are not giving their full attention to the text. They're texting and they're looking stuff up and they're like, where did I see that actor again? And so I don't know that pop culture is being crafted in the same way. Like it's just designed for different audiences. When I talk to my students about how they're watching things, they're watching clips of films on TikTok. They're not watching the actual films. And this is no shade to students, but just we're having to reteach them how to watch a movie and
Mm.
how to read a book because they've been brought up in this kind of media sphere. Whereas to me, being on TikTok it's both surprisingly addictive and also kind of hellish because I'm like, I don't even know how to get out of here.
No, it's interesting. I've actually had to do that myself. I've been trying to get much more into reading. I would read pieces that I was going to, interview somebody about, but I'm trying to read more for fun and for pleasure. And it's hard, man. Like if you haven't done it for a while, like it is hard to sit down and read a book because your brain just starts going in so many directions, and you see a word you don't know. Let me look it up right away. You don't have to like get off the couch and go find a dictionary. It's like, oh, it's on my phone, or this reminds me of something else. It's just so difficult. So I hear you, and I've been trying to do the same thing to retrain myself to have patience to soak something in and really just let it take me over for a little while, whether it's a movie, a show, or a book or something, because it has kind of left our DNA in a way.
Yeah, it's harder and harder to concentrate for sure, but I think as well it's especially at what my friends who are parents are finding is like just kind of creating a prohibition around
Mm.
social media or being like, okay, your screen time is up. That's not really working because kids are like, well, okay, but what about this other screen time? Or what about and it's not just like kids' natural ability to argue. It's more just like this is the kind of sphere that they've grown up in.
Mhm.
So teaching them kind of literacy around media and being like, okay, here's a good use of the internet and here's a use that's probably not going to be so good. I think it applies to kind of adults of our generation as well. Like if I'm reading a book and I've got my phone next to me and I tell myself, don't look anything up, immediately that part of my brain that's used to looking things up is like, oh, that's an interesting. What was going on in 1987? Like, I should probably check out what the top films are. And sometimes I find it's a little more useful to just be like, okay, you've got 5 minutes at some point to look this stuff up and then come back to it. Bringing it back to Labyrinth, like one of the things I find interesting about the character of Sarah is that she has like no ecosystem around her. Like she doesn't have friends.
Mhm.
She's not dating anyone. She's just like a huge nerd who wants to kind of live in these fantasy worlds, which is how I grew up as well. But then when she's torn out of her world and put into this kind of this new world of the labyrinth, she can't really solve anything through like brute force. She can't be charming. She just every vignette in that film is like a weird critical exercise in critical thinking, and sometimes the choices that she makes are the wrong choices, but she still has to choose no matter what. And that to me is kind of being the horror of being an adult, right? Where it's like I get the water bill and I get the sewer bill, and I'm like, okay, I gotta pay one of these, and I don't want to pay either, but
You put it more eloquently than
so
I do, because I was rewatching the movie and I said to my wife at one point, "God, Sarah sucks. Like she's just
yeah,
like she's always complaining. It's not fair. She
it's
doesn't want to
not fair,
babysit
yeah.
her little brother. Like all these things. I'm just like, oh my gosh, like this girl. And then I'm reading your book and I felt guilty because you talk about how all the critics ripped her apart. And I was like, well, I wasn't trying to be mean, but she has that air about her where like she's not always a likable character, which makes it's another interesting layer to the film because usually you want to root for the main character, and sometimes I'm like, I kind of hope the helping hands drop her.
Yeah, she's very similar to like the character in the children's novel The Secret Garden, Mary Lennox, who is kind of like really just irritating. But I kind of love that part of the book where she's very prickly and doesn't really know how to talk to people. Sarah has that in the film. She has that, refrain like it's not fair, it's not fair. And I'm fascinated by what the writers do there because at one point she says it's not fair to the Goblin King, and Bowie says, you keep saying that. I wonder what your basis for comparison is. What do you think is fair? And then later in the film, when she takes away her gift from Hoggle, he says, it's not fair. And then she replies, you're right, it's not, but maybe that's the point. And it sounds weird for this kind of artist, for Henson as an artist to say, okay, my lesson for kids is life sucks and you just have to keep going. But that really was his experience. Like his brother died quite young. He was exposed to mortality right away. He felt like he had this kind of ticking clock following him. He knew that he was going to die young, and he did die young. And so there's this sense of like needing kids to realize you have to set aside this binary of fair, unfair, and find a kind of space in the middle, or else you're going to be miserable all the time. But he, as a person, like, he also had this kind of discomfort with fame. One moment I cite in the book is that he drove this incredibly flashy car,
Mhm.
but he hated being interviewed. he was able to, like, he would throw these masquerade parties where he'd wander around in a mask and he'd be so social, but then in interviews, like, he's just sinking into himself. He doesn't want to talk to anyone at all. And so I think he was kind of reaching out to both types of child viewer as well, like, the overconfident one, and then the one who's kind of a shrinking violet as well.
You mentioned earlier in this conversation the idea there's no real romance in this movie, which when we look back at pop culture classics, there tends to be some sort of romantic thing going on, whether it's obvious or it's sort of underlay, but there's nothing in Labyrinth at all like that. And even Sarah, which she shouldn't be, but she's not sexualized at all. I mean, she's a 15, Jennifer Connelly, I think, was 15 when she filmed this movie, so she should not be sexual.
Yeah.
But like, we're so used to seeing that it's almost strikes you as odd that she's wearing a baggy shirt with a vest and, you mentioned jeans and comfortable shoes. Like, we're so used to seeing the female lead sexualized in some way that it's almost strange to not see that happen.
Yeah, I think about, like, comparing it to a film like The Breakfast Club, where you have Molly Ringwald as already kind of like a teen sex symbol, although that was not something I don't think that she wanted for
No.
herself. And I love that Molly Ringwald went on to, like, get a PhD in comparative literature and just, like, translate French novels. Like, she's just living her best life. But if you think the way that she was portrayed in The Breakfast Club versus Ali Sheedy's character, who, it's like, you could either be this incredibly beautiful, popular teen girl, or you could be this, like, kind of trollish, like,
Mm-hmm.
goblin-like teen girl. But then the two, there, where she's trying to make over Ali Sheedy, it's like, oh, there's actually really only one choice. You have to look like Molly Ringwald. Whereas Jennifer Connelly, she's like a conventionally attractive teen girl, but Henson kind of did this interesting thing where he's like, I'm not going to enhance this in any way. We're not going to draw attention to your appearance. The only time they do is when they put her in this kind of ethereal dress when she's dancing at this goblin masquerade. But that's meant to be very unsettling. And that actually makes me think of the conversation that you were having with Veronica Litt about Clueless, where the weird kind of age difference between in the romance with Alicia Silverstone and Paul Rudd. And it's weird in the novel Emma, which the film is based on as well. I think you're meant to kind of see it as a little bit off kilter. We can't really root for a relationship between Sarah and the Goblin King.
God,
He's
no.
probably like a thousand years old. But it fascinates me that Henson, he chose to cast this very marketable teen actress and then said, I'm not going to put her in a high school relationship. I'm going to put her in a kind of abusive relationship with a fairy tale character, because he's not really modeling relationships in any, like, visible way. There's a great quote from his son Brian Henson where he says, "My parents were the love of each other's lives who could not live with each other."
Mm,
And that seemed to be like the way he saw relationships, was like, it's kind of impossible
yeah.
to coexist with another person, but we still keep trying to do it.
I do want to. There was another story that you talk about that I thought was interesting. That did Jim officially get sued for using the goblins? I think there was. Okay, so there's one thing that you did not mention that I actually have always viewed, and I was expecting to see it in the book. I always thought the Goblin King was sort of taken from Maleficent in Sleeping Beauty, because if
Yeah,
you watch Sleeping Beauty, there's like the
yeah,
scene where David Bowie is sitting with the goblins in the castle and they're watching
yeah,
what Sarah's doing. I'm
it's
like,
true.
this is literally a scene from Sleeping Beauty right
Yeah,
now. Like, they all start
yeah.
laughing at, because he's laughing, they want to laugh harder. I'm like, I've watched this
Mhm.
movie before, like this part. So it is interesting that there was somebody that sued Jim Henson. You can maybe go into the story more, but it's interesting somebody feels they lay claim to the idea of some of these things where I'm like, this is a story as old as time, some of these things.
Yeah, and if it's funny, like, I think as well, when I watch Labyrinth, it was around the same time as, like, when Masters of the Universe came
Yeah,
out, the He-Man cartoon, and Skeletor is a very similar character. Like, he's got all these henchmen, but he has total contempt for them, and it's always like, "You ninny," but
yeah,
it's like he's not mean about it. He can't be all that mean. So there was a real popularity, I think, in the '80s of, like, the disaffected villain who thinks he's smarter than everyone. And to me, that's like just a tech bro now, basically.
basically.
But yeah, in terms of the connections to fairy tales, like, there is that. I think Henson was mining a lot of different children's stories. There is a lot of similarity between the plot of Labyrinth and the plot of a children's book by the author Maurice Sendak, who's most known for Where the Wild Things Are. But at the same time, that's a really old story,
Mhm.
like the story of the changeling. These are kind of like old Celtic stories where it's like your child gets abducted by fairies and replaced by a weird child who has all these powers, and you have to go to the fairy realm to get them back. And I argue in the book that it's a kind of an interesting way, maybe, for looking at kids that didn't act the way that parents wanted them to. Like it could be a connection to what kids that we would now call like neurodivergent, where the parents are like, "Why aren't you being like your brothers and sisters? The fairies must have kidnapped you." So Sendak didn't quite sue Henson, but they kind of got close, and it seems like it kind of burned out their working relationship, which was too bad. And in the end, Henson agreed to sort of include one of Maurice Sendak's books in one of the scenes, and he's credited as a kind of a consultant, although I think that's what they agreed upon. But what I found interesting about that story is like Sendak really went after Henson and was quite angry that he felt like his story had been plagiarized, and Henson was oblivious. He was so surprised by this, he had not considered it. So we're left with a lot of questions about this, but it feels like Henson was just, in the way that a lot of artists do, he was drawing elements from different stories. And it was maybe doing that a little bit carelessly, but it's also a testament to his brain, where he would just like draw all these different elements and put them together. Okay, we've got goblins, but we've also got a middle class 80s home, and we've got if we think about how the Goblin King was originally supposed to be a puppet. Like, what a different
Oh, wow.
movie that would have been. And that was how he started. And that script went through so many changes and so many writers that in the end, what we're looking at, it's almost like a medieval manuscript that got written over again and again and again. We can't really get to the core of the story.
You talk about in the book about how David Bowie wasn't the first choice to play the Goblin
No.
King. But everything hindsight is 2020, but looking at it, I think the magic of that movie rests solely on David Bowie's shoulders. And David Bowie's not even in the movie a ton when you look back on it. He's not the main character of the film.
No.
Sarah's the main character of the film. But David Bowie's presence, and it makes me wonder why he didn't do more acting, because he just
Yeah.
has such a presence on that camera that you can't take your eyes off him. I mean, there's just something so magical about this human being that movie is not the same and probably doesn't have the longevity that it's had without David Bowie.
I feel like Henson probably saw him. Well, actually, the official story is that Henson wanted to cast someone who had musical appeal,
Mm.
and but he was looking at it from a kind of parent's perspective. He wasn't really looking at the music that was extraordinarily popular at the time. And it was Brian Henson who said you should do David Bowie
Mm.
because David Bowie kind of has cross appeal. At the same time, I think Henson probably saw Bowie in he did an early 80s horror movie called The Hunger,
Oh,
where
yeah.
he plays a vampire, and probably was like, okay, this performer has real kind of acting chops. An anecdote in one of the documentaries about Henson, where the writer Brian Froud talks about how being on set with Bowie, people kind of treated him like he was a god, and he was actually quite uncomfortable with that. And there was one moment where there were a bunch of people on set, and I can't remember exactly what they were doing. They were just kind of trying to rejig a set, and Bowie just kind of appeared out of his trailer because they were all having lunch, and he said, "Do you mind if I have lunch with you guys?" And they were like, Okay, like we didn't think that was an option." And he said, "Yeah, on set, nobody really talks to me because I think they're scared to talk to me." So he was actually quite lonely. Like he was just in his
Mm.
trailer, kind of wishing for human contact. And that's something I think that Bowie imbues into the character of the Goblin King. There's that moment, which was the moment that I kept coming back to as a kid, that I found really kind of interesting and empowering, where Sarah realizes that the Goblin King doesn't have any power over her. But just before she realizes that, he says to her, like, I just need you to let me control you. Like, will you just let me do this? Just admit that I have this power, and then I'll let you do anything that you want, which is the kind of the magical contract that we often see in fairy tales between mortals and immortals. And Bowie, he just he imbues real humanity and desperation in that moment. He could play him like a mustache twirling villain, but he really is vulnerable. He's like, I'm annoyed that I have to admit that this 14-year-old girl has power over me, but I just want everything to kind of stay the same. And it's Sarah who says, "Oh, actually, you never had any power for me from the start."
It's such a fascinating read. I haven't said the actual title of the book. I think you mentioned it, but it's called It's Only Forever, Labyrinth. It's part of the Pop Classics series through ECW Press. This is number 17 in the series, and I'm just loving everything that I touch from this series. So I'm so glad that you took it upon yourself to dive into Labyrinth, because as I mentioned earlier in the conversation, you opened my eyes to so many things that from my perspective and from the way that I grew up, my culture, I had not looked at it from that way. And now to look at it again through a different lens is really interesting to see how this movie has inspired so many other people as well. So I would suggest anybody who's ever watched Labyrinth and enjoyed it to definitely check out this book. Jess, where do people go if they want to find out more information about you or to I know you're an author, you've written a bunch of other books as well. Where do people go to find out everything that you've got going on?
Well, I have a author website. It's just jbattis.com. That's the kind of easiest spot. I'm also on Instagram, just under my regular name, Jes Battis. I'm on Blue Sky. I sometimes yell about politics and philosophy and things like that. So I'm pretty easy to find. And I work at a university in the prairies, and I'm accessible that way as well. You know, I'm always willing to answer questions about university programs and creative writing and things like that.
Well, Jess, I appreciate your time so much about this. Your cat seems to have calmed down, which is also great.
Yeah.
But yeah, this has been such a great conversation. I love going back through my childhood and just, I don't know, trying to look at things in a different way again. And this was a complete mind F to me because there were so many things I hadn't thought about. But no, I loved it, Jess. Thank you so much for all your time.
Thanks so much for having me on that. It was a real pleasure.
I will tell you this about Labyrinth before I let you go. The one thing that I was just actually rewatching it this morning too, to kind of give it another fresh look. The one thing that I still cannot figure out to this day, there's that scene where Sarah tricks the doors, right? Like there's like before she falls to the helping hands. I still don't understand it. Like I still don't understand her logic. Like I'm like, how does this make any sense?
It's an impossible answer, or it's an impossible riddle, and her overconfidence, right? It's a piece of cake, and then she falls down into those helping hands. I sort of think about that as when we're trying to kind of plan for life, we always think, okay, yeah, we figured it out, and I think Henson put that in as an Easter egg to make you realize no matter how much you work on that problem, you're never going to figure it out. You're always going to end up falling down, and the people that think that they're helping you are sometimes actually harming you. But then in the end, you know, she falls down all the way to the center of the labyrinth, and there's that kind of miraculous moment where Hoggle's like, "Oh, we just flipped this door over," and you're out. You're in a different spot. So it's I think Henson was definitely thinking about the kind of the how life comes at you in waves, and there's always a possibility there.
It's true. When you watch the old movies from your childhood, you watch them again as an adult, you pick up on so many different things. Although I will say I watched Neverending Story not terribly long ago, and I was like, this is awful. Why did I rent this so many times as a child? I don't like I don't want to watch it again because it's going to ruin my childhood if I watch it again.
I'll tell you something that will make it even worse.
Okay, please.
In the novel that it's based on by Michael Ende, the horse Artax in the novel he has human speech. And so in that scene in the Swamps of Sadness, the horse tells Atreyu, "You have to let me die, because because I'm going to drag you down, and I've made peace with it." And it's so much worse when the horse actually has a conversation with Atreyu and says, "You've got to go on this quest, and I'm okay with it. Don't worry."
That's awful.
So I'm so sorry to tell you that, but I tell everyone that after, because the book is even darker, but really, really fascinating.
Now I kind of want to read the book.
It's really cool because where the movie ends, you know, Fantasia ends and Bastian has to wish it back into being. The second half of Michael Ende's book is just Bastian making the worst wishes possible and creating like the wrong world, and he wants to become ruler of the world. Like he becomes a dictator until Falkor and Atreyu everyone make him realize you're drunk with power, and because Endo was really focused on like fascism in the novel, so it's really, really cool read.
I'll have to check it out. Now I have to do that. Add one more thing to the list here, Jes. Big thank you to Jes Battis. The book, It's Only Forever, Labyrinth, part of ECW Press's Pop Classic series, is available now if you want to grab it. These books are so much fun, really entertaining, and they're pretty affordable as well. I cannot wait for the next one to come out so we can have another good conversation for the show. And thank you to all of you for listening this week. I appreciate your time. Until the next episode, be well.